Hello everyone, my name is Naomi Hogan. I'm joining from ACCR here today for our methane briefing for investors with a range of researchers. Thank you all for joining, and just to let you know, this session is being recorded. I am the Strategic Projects Lead here at ACCR, and I'll be the host for this webinar. I'd like to start, I'm based in Australia, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the First Nations people for the land on which I'm on, the Awabakal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and First Nations people everywhere. Thank you all for joining, and thank you so much to our experts who are joining us to share their insights and expertise, technical knowledge, and incredible experience tracking methane, reporting, measurement, and collaborations and what's coming forward. We're going to learn about what technology is being harnessed in the methane space at the moment, what's coming next, and what this means for investors in the companies where methane is an issue. We're certainly seeing this emerging as an area of concern for potential underreporting of Scope 1 emissions, and it's a critical issue when we're thinking of climate change and methane being such a potent heat trapping gas. So an incredibly important area for further work. So tonight or today, wherever you're joining from around the world, we will go through each of the speakers. We'll give a 5 to 6 minute presentation, and then we're going to jump into a panel style discussion. And because we have so many speakers and so little time, I'm going to jump straight into it and pass over to Andrew Baxter from the EDF to give some opening remarks. Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks, Naomi, and thanks ACCR for having us here today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Yeah, I mean, today you're going to hear a lot about the impact of methane emissions on the climate. And with a global warming potential of over 80 times that of carbon dioxide over 20 years, methane emissions is contributing to over a quarter of the warming that we feel today. And the IPCC and other bodies say in no uncertain terms that there's no path to 1.5 degrees Celsius warming limits without methane emissions reductions immediately. When we say methane emissions, like the major anthropogenic sources of these emissions are the coal industry, oil and gas industry, waste, and agriculture. And there's a huge opportunity to drive down emissions from these industries. But the blockers have been a lack of focus on that issue, as well as a dearth of quality data to inform where the largest reductions are possible. Methane emissions are broadly underreported and misrepresented by companies, making decisions and engagement by investors and other stakeholder groups challenging, as well as actual mitigation efforts by the companies quite difficult. But this is changing, and an increasing amount of data from scientists across the globe highlights the scale of this issue. It focuses our attention on where to act, and it bolsters stakeholder engagement with industry. Just whilst talking about climate and energy, it would be amiss to mention that, or amiss not to mention that the war in Ukraine has a profound consequence for energy markets, leading to high and volatile prices for fossil fuels and greater near-term competition for non-Russian supplies of gas. The market turbulence spotlights energy security vulnerabilities, and methane has a role to play. Methane gas, simply put, is lost energy that could be used to address this. So methane gas capture projects are a tangible way in which at least oil and gas methane emissions can be reduced, and short-term global high pressures can be alleviated. The IEA reports that 210 billion cubic meters of natural gas could be made available to gas markets by a global effort to eliminate non-emergency flaring and reduce methane emissions from oil and gas operations and across that part of the fossil fuel supply chain. Furthermore, the IEA estimates that 75% of methane emissions from the oil and gas industry could be abated with currently available technology. and 45% at no net cost, due to the value of the captured gas. So this makes sense. Like, it makes engaging on methane emissions a great target for investors, because you have material climate benefits, but also it makes business sense. This is not purely a cost center. This is addressing many problems at once. The latest methane science has expanded our understanding on the causes and the impacts of methane emissions. And I believe it's foundational to driving us towards a new paradigm on measurement, reporting, and verification of emissions, as well as targeted emission reductions. And just to conclude, I mean, investors have been critical in driving the adoption of targets, metrics, and the emergence of new voluntary programs, as well as new regulation in the oil and gas industry. They've been a huge driver in oil and gas engagement, and I think investors have the power and the influence to influence change and methane emissions reductions in the real world within the coal, waste, and ag industries in which they invest as well. So yeah, really, really looking forward to the discussion today, and thanks again to ACCR for bringing together such an excellent range of perspectives on this topic. Thanks, Naomi. I'll hand it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. We'll kick right off. A note to any of the participants here, if you'd like to ask questions to have answered later, please pop them into the Q&A chat and we will try and get to them at the end. I'll introduce now Professor Ilse Augen from the ESRON Netherlands Institute for Space Research, who the recent paper on methane emissions from super emitting coal mines is greatly relevant to many of the investors who hold companies involved in the Bowen Basin.
All right, thanks. And thanks for asking me and being able to present this. I'll jump right into it. All right, so I'll be talking about tropomi observations. Tropomi has been is a satellite instrument, has been a real game changer in the field of measuring methane from space. And it's measuring a lot of, it has been launched in 2017. It measures a lot of species, but also methane. And the unique thing about tropomi is that it sees the whole Earth in one day. So it has daily global coverage. And it combines that with individual observations looking at an area of only 7 by 5.5 kilometers. And that makes for a very powerful combination. Because what in particular where it appeared to be very good at is detecting these so-called methane super emitters globally. And this is the first time we can actually do that. So these methane super emitters are really very localized sources of methane that emit a lot of methane. And this can come from coal mines or from landfills or from oil and gas infrastructure. And this slide is showing you what we are seeing in 2020, at least as far as the verified detections go. And we've seen lots of these super emitters, which we had not really expected. And the lower limit for what we're seeing is around 5 to 10 tons per hour. So everything we see is more than that, which means it's huge, actually. I'll go through a few examples, starting in Australia here, and then going to Kazakhstan and the United States to illustrate what we can do. So kicking off here with what we've been seeing and reported in this paper in Queensland. And what you see is a number of observations for different days, and we see it actually every day, so it's persistent. And if you look carefully, you see these signals in red, means high methane. You see signals coming from 3 different locations. One here in the north turns out to be coming from Hill Creek, a surface mine. And then there's 2 other locations where we cannot distinguish which mine it is, but there's a few mines that might contribute. So what we did is that we used 2 years of tropomi data where we estimated the emissions, and the numbers are given here for these 3 locations. And these numbers are big, and I'll put it in perspective in a minute here. And I want to emphasize that the one on Hill Creek is related to a surface mine, whereas the rest relates to underground mines where we know emissions can be high, but which is not known from surface mines. So when I put it in perspective, what we did is on this side, you see the TRPOMI estimates, and left to it, you see the bars that correspond to the reported emissions. And there's one caveat. We don't know the values per mine. We just know the total at Queensland level for underground mines on one hand and for surface mines on the other hand. And then we have to disaggregate to the different coal mines themselves, and then we can compare. So that's the caveat here. But what is particularly remarkable, of course, is the difference for the surface mine emissions that we get from TRPOMI compared to what is being reported, just because the knowledge is, common knowledge is that, and also that's what IPCC writes, that needs to be used are emission factors that are actually quite low for surface mines. To put things a bit more in perspective, this one surface mine is responsible for 1% of the coal production, but our numbers show that the emission is as large as 25% of what is reporting for all coal mines in Australia. So that's a huge number. Now, another thing that we can do with satellites is actually combine the different satellites. So with TRPOMI, we have the global view. We see these hotspots, like I showed on the map, and we can provide that information on the location to GGSat. And GGSat is a commercial company that has small satellites that can zoom in. They can only look at a small area of 10 by 15 kilometers, but look at methane concentrations at 25-meter resolution. So they can really pinpoint what is the facility that is leaking. And that's very powerful. So here I will go look at Kazakhstan. There's actually a TRPOMI observation here. It's in the center is roughly the source, and you see the signal going with the wind. And then we can zoom in after having provided that location to GeoGSat. We use data from TRPOMI from different days with different winds. So you see the signal going in different directions. And with this, we can localize where the source probably is. And then we provide it to GeoGSat, who then can zoom in. And it turns out that this is, again, a surface mine, as you can see in the background image, high resolution image, with the two signals on top of it, as observed by GeoGSat. And these add up to 60 tons per hour. And that is really, really huge. This is only one day, of course. Then we have an example here on a mine, an underground mine in Pennsylvania. On the left-hand side, you see the TRPOMI image, averaged. Then they zoom in on the location that we provide. They actually see 4 plumes. And if you look more carefully at the one in the upper right, just as an example, you can actually see it's coming from a vent. Now, just to wrap up, this is what we can do already. And more methane satellites will come up. On one hand, we'll have the successor of TRPOMI, the Sentinel-5. We'll have 3 of them, so covering 2 decades of measurements, TRPOMI-like measurements. GGSat is putting out more satellites. In their constellation, there will be Carbon Mapper. That's a public initiative in a few years, similar resolution as GGSat. Then we'll have Methane Sat from EDF at slightly other resolution, and the European CO2 mission. So that's a whole range of more methane satellites to come. So this was just to wrap up. We see for the first time with these super emitters with TRPOMI, it's been a real game changer. The combination with the high spatial resolution satellites is extremely powerful to identify what is really emitting. And this information can be used to prioritize climate mitigation action. More satellites to come. And it would be very good if there would be more transparency in these reported emissions per facilities that helps interpret the satellite data. And that's it from my part.
Thank you so much, Ilse. That was amazing in terms of getting a really quick snapshot into what we're seeing from the methane satellites and what they can do and what you can actually see there. So thank you. And we can come back to that with more questions as I can see they're coming through. But first, we'll go to Dr. Dimitri Lafleur. He is a carbon analyst at Global Climate Insights here at ACCR. He's worked as a geoscientist, an atmospheric scientist, and has a PhD covering fugitive and overseas emissions from Australian fossil fuel exports. Thank you, Dimitri.
During this presentation, I hope to get across that yes, you can quantify methane emissions, be it from a country, from a region, or from a company, but it requires investment beyond measurements here and there. I'll touch on a key component of the method to quantify emissions, and I'll share what oil and gas companies are doing and what they should be doing. But I'd like to set the scene by showing you why fossil fuel methane really matters. And you are aware that methane emissions from fossil fuel extraction, in particularly coal and gas, contribute a significant portion to the rise in atmospheric methane concentrations. But anyway, so there is a paper in Nature 2020 that showed that pre-industrial fossil methane emissions, so those are the natural emissions from geological sources, such as seeps from subsurface reservoirs, containing methane that nowadays we extract for coal and gas, are roughly 1/10 of the current estimates from bottom-up calculations. And it's unlikely that it has changed over the last 200 years, which means that global methane emissions from anthropogenic fossil fuel sources like coal and gas are some 20 to 40% higher than we currently are estimating. And here on the right-hand side, you see the air bubbles from Antarctic ice cores that contain C14. So that's the isotope carbon-14 that is used to do this research. And this means that industrial age anthropogenic fossil methane emissions are much bigger than we think they are. And this is consistent with all the studies that conclude that methane emissions are underreported based on actual measurements. So it's crucial that we get better handle on quantifying fossil fuel emissions. In terms of quantifying, it's one thing to measure methane concentrations, but that measurement does not tell you anything about the emissions. You need a model to tell you where that methane came from. And the forward problem is that you feed a model emission data from certain locations, and the model will, given the atmospheric dynamics, calculate the concentrations. The inverse problem is that you back calculate using concentration measurements where the emissions should have come from and how large they should have been. And the key here is that you have sufficient data, and in particular, long-term continuous concentration data that you measure from multiple fixed sites. And then you can constrain the model further by adding more data, an emission inventory, for example, or satellite data. And here on the right-hand side, there's an example where the Swiss national inventory is used with concentration data from fixed locations across Switzerland and inverse modeling to validate the inventory and to improve it, and therefore informing long-term policy. And likewise, you could use this for company emission strategies. It can validate emission submissions to the UN, for example, supporting the efforts to meet the Paris Agreement goals. So inversions can ascertain the emissions from an area of interest as large as Switzerland or the Los Angeles Basin. But you can do the same for an energy basin where multiple oil and gas companies are active, such as the Permian Basin in the US, or across licensed acreage to one single oil and gas company. Oil and gas facilities are not as large as coal mines, so you can't rely just on satellite data alone. You need additional measurements. And I can touch on other examples, but I'd like to highlight what oil and gas companies are doing and what is missing, crucially missing. I've put three here on the sheet for you to read and ask questions on, but I'd like to focus on Exxon. Part of Exxon's transition plan, or the Advancing Climate Solutions, as they call it, and these are the business plans that Global Climate Insights analyzes to see how they are positioned in a decarbonizing world, is that it has a methane intensity target, just like other companies. But it seems to have quite an extensive portfolio to measure methane emissions using satellites, flights, airborne data, and device measurements. And the venture with Skepta Incorporated, announced late last year, I must admit, it sounds exciting. They're launching 24 satellites that initially will focus on Exxon's Permian Basin assets, but appears to expand to monitor operations around the world. They're also working with the Canadian satellite company GHGSat to finance monitoring methane plumes in Iraq. And if that's successful, then they could extend that to other parts of the world. The one thing that are missing, as are other companies, are these continuous measurements, which are crucial, and they don't mention inverse modeling either. Exxon is not known for its emission reduction targets, its Paris-aligned transition strategy, or its disclosure. So I do have some reservations until I see some results coming out of this, but it comes closest to what is best practice for good methane measurements from a company perspective, if they would use both observations and modeling techniques to quantify emissions. So the takeaway message here is that yes, you can quantify methane emissions from sites or from regions or energy basins, but you do need both the measurement portfolio from in situ continuous measurements from satellites, from devices, and the modeling techniques to quantify the emissions from the concentration measurements. And it's the duty of the fossil fuel companies to quantify and properly disclose their methane emissions to shareholders.
Pass on to Professor Jörg Hacker, who is a professor at Flinders University and Chief Scientist and Director at Airborne Research Australia, using instrumented aircraft for environmental research, including methane emissions.
My presentation will be in a way much narrower because I nearly exclusively focus on airborne measurements, which is what exactly we do. I mean, funnily enough, in Ilse's presentation, there was a lot said about the Hale Creek mine, Queensland in the Bowen Basin. And it happens that when that went around the world, I was actively flying around mine measuring methane. That was not planned. It just happened that as a coincidence. So the current methods to measure methane is either determined by the operator of the mines. Obviously, that needs independent checking, as has been said a few times already. Satellite remote sensing needs ground truthing. Otherwise, well, nobody believes them, but there are, because some measurements go very far away from what is known, there is often great doubts that this can be true. Airborne and ground-based remote sensing is also the same thing because it's something you can't really touch. Whereas airborne in situ has one big advantage, and that is if you use technology, measurements are indisputable, so to say, but the problem is in the interpretation, which can be questions. Also, one has to be say very clearly that airborne methods are generally snapshots in time. In theory, it is very simple to take airborne measurements, in situ measurements of methane. One flies a suitable instrumented aircraft downwind of the sources along a stack of crosswind transects. We call that curtains or walls, between about 50 meters above the ground or lower even, and 1,000 meters above the ground. So you have to cover the whole atmospheric layer. From the aircraft, you measure CH4 concentrations, which is basically the same as the parameter that comes from the satellites, but you can measure it very accurately in situ, 1 to 3 pp. Sorry, there's a typo. It's not ppm, but ppb accuracy, and it has to be captured every few meters along the flight path to make sense of it. Also, you measure the horizontal wind, which you need to do the emissions, and it is obviously more accurately than if you use atmospheric models to get the wind, as is done in the satellite emission measurements. To do this, you also need moderately reasonable steady wind conditions so that the plume has a direction where it goes to. Otherwise, it's very difficult to interpret. And then you use appropriate processing strategies to interpret these measurements to get estimates. And the current accuracy you can achieve is about 10 to 15% of the value that you get. Issues are in terms of, and I'm focusing on open cut coal mines, like for instance, Hale Creek. It is not necessary to fly very close to the source. 2 kilometers is close enough. So it's an advantage that you do not need permission to fly required from the mine operator. In fact, if you could even say that the mine operator will not even know that measurements are being taken. So that's similar to the satellite. Also, that's better known when it's taken. We found it's also a great advantage if the person, or in fact the scientist who will process the data, is on board of the aircraft during the measurement flights, because you can then control the flight. And you need to see the flight while the data while you're in the aircraft, so that you can change your measurement strategy. If the mine operator agrees, you can flow very much closer, and then you can, and we've done that, identify individual sources within the mine itself. which may help to come up with mitigation methods if you can pinpoint the location in the mine where the main emissions come from. What I'm going to show now is a few examples that we recently captured using our aircraft. This is one of our aircraft. It's special mission aircraft, and we have very sophisticated instrumentation mounted under the wing. We can fly low and slow and do these measurements very accurately. So this is a collection of measurements we did over the last 2 to 3 years. On the left-hand side, this is an example of a large open-cut coal mine. There's the coal mine, and it's several kilometers wide, so you have a relatively large source area. That means your plume, if you have a wind from, in this case, from the north, you fly transects in various heights, about 2 kilometers from the mine. And in this case, we flew a second one about 13 kilometers from the mine. One can do more transects, and I show one example of that. And you measure the concentrations there very accurately. And then you have your curtains and walls. Typically, in this case, we have seen on these transects exceedances from the background CH4 methane of 300 to 400 ppb, which is already quite a lot, even 13 kilometers away from the mine. We have also done this with LNG processing facilities. This one is from the Surat Basin, also in Australia, where you have a single processing plant, which is a point source. You have the mean wind, and you can see this is the emissions from the aircraft that flew along these lines. You automatically get the wind from the aircraft, so you have basically you have to do nothing else than multiply the concentration with the wind, and you get the emission from that. I can also show we've done this with feedlots, which focuses in the agriculture, so you can see individual sources in that feedlot. Or, I said before, you can fly multiple transects. Here you can see the extent, in this case up to 25 kilometers away from a relatively small source. And here is basically my final image. We flew very close to the edge of the mine where there were active mining operations. And this is the concentrations of methane we saw. So you can then go down into the mine and say, well, this is the operation which generates the methane, the biggest methane emissions. In this case, the biggest exceedance was 4,000 ppb, which is massive. Basically, a take-home message is the only viable strategy for worldwide ongoing monitoring methane emissions from open-cut coal mine and other sources is most probably using satellite-based remote sensing, but only if such measurements and the underlying algorithms have been thoroughly tested and validated by in situ airborne measurements. This has not been done really extensively because it's a complex task and it's also not cheap. It takes a lot of effort. Thank you very much.
Very interesting, and I'm starting to get the vibe that there's not going to be many places to hide emissions any longer with all of these different methodologies in play currently. Let's pass over now to Anatoly Smirnov, who is the coal mine methane lead at EMBA, working with UNEP, working with the International Methane Emissions Observatory, and has background on the coalface as well in coal mine methane utilisation projects.
So I'm Anatoly Smirnov. I'm from a company, from an NGO called EMBA, who have predominantly been focused on turning data into action and in the clean energy sector, clean electricity sector. But recently, about 2 years ago, we have entered the coal mine methane emissions sector specifically. And even more recently, we have started to focus on a lot of our focus was on Australia because it's a really interesting country for many reasons in terms of coal mine methane. Just a few weeks ago, we published a report called Tackling Australia's Coal Mine Methane Problem, which was quite well received and referenced by the media and other NGOs and politicians. And we are now building on this to work with NGOs such as Sunrise, Log the Gate, ACCR obviously, and others to promote action on CMM mitigation in Australia. And we're also very junior partners in the MetCoal Methane Partnership alongside EDF, UNEP, and International Methane Emissions Observatory and some Australian coal companies to design a volunteer initiative for MRV, measurement, reporting, verification, and mitigation of mining companies in similar vein as oil and gas. Like globally in the energy sector, we think that methane leaks from oil and gas, but in Australia, it's actually very different. It's actually really dominated by coal mine methane emissions, which just because Australia is such a massive coal mine methane coal mining country, it far outstrips the impact of the CO2 emissions from the cars in Australia, and obviously of the actual oil and gas, based on today's official government data, likely to be as underestimate. Up until recently, the assumption was that the major problem came from the underground. So because underground coal mines actually carry out measurements and they're extremely methane intensive. Whereas for surface mine, people assume that it's very low. And so the emissions reported to the UNFCCC, to the Australian regulator, was far, far lower. But this was based on not on actual measurements, but on using emission factors. So multiplying the volume of coal produced by an assumed factor rather than an actual measurement. We are very quickly see there is a lot of challenges to these assumptions coming up. So the first biggest challenge is from the International Energy Agency, who use a combination of bottom-up measurements with some satellite analysis. And they estimate that the Australian numbers are across the coal mining sector are about half what the actual figure seems to be on the whole sector. But this is not very precise. It's really high level analysis, but it's a first data point. Another data point just excellently presented by Ilse, so I'm not going to go into much detail, but this satellites are clearly identifying massive plumes from surface coal mines, and this is just the first time we started looking. This is probably across the Australian surface mine sector, 35 times more than what you'd expect them to report to the regulator. And also Kairos is saying that Australian emissions are far higher than in the Bowen Basin than we assume today. And this is just really first steps happening in the last couple of years that this is beginning to really challenge the current paradigm that surface mines are not very emitting. We do not believe that discrepancy comes from the underground. Underground coal mines have, for safety reasons, have excellent, of course they are not perfect, but they have really solid measurement techniques in the mine. There's only a couple of shafts in the mine. You put meters there, you should be able to get reasonable data, not by a discrepancy of 35 times. So we really believe that the underestimates happen at the surface mine level, where nobody really understands how, until recently, really, it was really difficult to measure. Ground-based measurements are practically impossible. The mines are massive. You do not know where to put the meters. It's a real challenge. And only now with airborne measurements and satellites do we begin to approach the subject of how to measure them. And I think as we improve, we're going to get a lot of surprises in Australia and beyond. Our criticism of Australian surface miners is that they should do better in trying to get their estimates out. So far, all they were saying is that we follow official government methodologies, but these are too simplistic. They should really have, and they are definitely making changes. But until recently, they were really happy with the status quo, and we think that this is not really they should continue to improving very rapidly, because the pressure will be on them by the investors and by the global community and national governments. So as really well presented before me, so I'm not going to go into more detail, and I did miss out on airborne measurements because we don't know much about them at Ember yet. But as more satellites come online, companies position that their Scope 1 emission reporting is accurate will become less and less sustainable. The Australian government is under pressure to really improve this situation as well, and we expect them to change. We also see that on global level, governments will force exporters of coal, like people exporting to the EU, to measure to properly measure their emissions or face pretty serious penalties or even bans from importing coal. EU are the leaders on it, but we're certain it's going to happen in other countries. We also think that, for example, steel companies underreport their kind of, obviously in really good faith because they do not know this, but they underreport the impact of, technically I think it's scope 2 emissions or maybe even scope 3 emissions of steel, because steel calculations do not have methane in their carbon footprint. That adds up to 27% per ton of emissions per unit of steel. So just obvious points to the investors and the companies that they should really improve and do best practice measurements using a combination of different data sources, ground, airborne, and satellites. Scope 1 emissions data should really use actual measurements and not desktop emission factors. Corporate reports should also be independently verified, because too often the number is just one single number in the middle of a huge report. It's difficult to believe them. It's like, even if they're done in the best of faith, there should be somebody to verify this. And companies should work on identifying, quantifying, and mitigating leaks where feasible.
Thanks so much, Anatoly. That was coming through quite clearly in terms of some of the improvements needed there. So thank you for your work on that. I'd now like to pass to Dominic Watson from the EDF. The EDF have done a huge amount of work with companies, investors, governments, and civil society the world over, mainly focusing on oil and gas to date. So Dominic will give us some insights into that and where things might head from here. Thank you.
So thanks so much, Naomi, for the opportunity to present, and thanks to everyone listening in. And thanks as well to all the panelists who just presented, and for all of the excellent remarks so far. So my colleague Andrew opened with a bit of a why methane emissions and why focus on this topic. And I might also close with a why and why this matters for investors in particular. But maybe to start, just as a brief introduction to EDF, to the Environmental Defense Fund, and our team specifically. Andrew and I focus on working with the world's largest oil and gas companies and investors on reducing the release of methane emissions. And in doing so, we work across financial firms with banks, private equity, asset managers, and owners. And I think one of the questions that often comes up is, of the thousands of ESG topics to care about, of the thousands of topics that investors are asked to care about, from biodiversity to modern slavery to methane, and like why this issue, and why do we focus so intently on this one issue when there's a million pressing problems that we all have on our plates? And I think this issue resonates particularly with investors, because the climate impact, as we've heard earlier, is just so immediately actionable and material to investment portfolios. So as was, I believe, mentioned earlier today, methane emissions is one of the main drivers of climate risk and of climate warming that we're seeing today. The IPCC puts that number at about 30% of man-made warming from anthropogenic methane emissions. But in the oil and gas industry, at least, and to a lesser extent in other industries, technologies are available today and can be readily deployed to realize reductions that will reduce warming within our lifetimes. So I think Andrew mentioned some of the numbers around what can be deployed today feasibly and what is cost effective. But I think in the big picture, this is one of those issues that is table stakes for companies that are looking to transition to net zero. Addressing methane emissions from your operations is just absolute step one that helps you build credibility towards deeper decarbonization. So I think the big picture here for us is that this is not just a climate issue, but it's a business issue, and it's one of lost product and of operational excellence for these companies. But I guess despite the low-hanging fruit that we at EDF see, there's still a big disclosure gap out there. I think every panelist here spoke about the issues with the methane data out there, and how do you address this? And I think that's maybe one of the issues that's slowing progress here. And of all the investors we speak to, I think all of them are desperate to get their hands on better quality data. And one way that investors try to solve this problem, one well-trodden path, is through engagement with companies and discussions to try and get better disclosure. But what we've seen is for this topic in particular, that there's some challenges and some potential headwinds to trying to get better information. And I think the first one is what we like to call an information asymmetry, where companies are fully prepared, have been working on this issue for years. They have deep technical expertise and data on these issues, and investors are often spread across a number of topics, including methane and including different sectors as well. So in engagement conversations, companies can often just dive deep into the weeds and pull out numbers or get away from some of the questions very quickly. I think another potential issue for investors that we at EDF try to support on is differentiating between what's material and what's noise in these issues. So this, as we've seen today, this is an extremely complex and technical topic that gets very detailed very quickly, and pulling out what the right asks are of companies and what the specific things that companies should be doing and investors should be asking for them is no easy task. For example, how do you figure out what's an appropriate target for an oil and gas company and the basins they operate in? What's a good target for a coal company? And what voluntary reporting framework should they adhere to? What does good policy advocacy look like in different jurisdictions? I think all of these questions are very complex on their own. So I think the end result is the subject can appear daunting to approach, but we've found some success in supporting investor engagements by trying to help with education. And I think this is the same for all of the work that the panelists do here, is helping to close this information asymmetry by supporting investor engagements and educating on this issue. At EDF specifically, and we've seen this elsewhere, I think we try and put forward a set of very simple asks for investors to put forward to companies on target setting, policy, disclosure, and a clear set of engagement priorities that they can raise with companies. We also, in all of our conversations, aim to back discussions with scientific data, and where possible, support investors so that they can pull from real world scientific studies and examples to engage with companies. For example, in the Permian Basin in West Texas, we've had a 2-year scientific study with near real-time data published, where we've given that data to investors, and they've gone out and spoken with executive teams at companies about specific leaks that are happening, and pointing out the discrepancies between their desktop reported data and the leaks that our aircraft and overflights are detecting, and talking to them about how they can explain this difference. So we found that as another useful point. But I think potentially most critically, we try to frame this as much as possible as an opportunity for these companies, rather than a pure accountability exercise, and a way for us all to move towards the same goal of net zero. So maybe just to close this out, I'll highlight one case study for all of this, which is one of our main priorities for oil and gas companies, which is our work with investors to drive adoption of a reporting framework called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, or just add another acronym to the long list of acronyms in the space, OGMP. And OGMP is a comprehensive measurement-based methane emissions reporting framework that aims to get at a lot of the issues that were highlighted here between desktop measurements and providing a pathway towards more credible direct measurement. And currently, about 50% of global oil and gas production is covered under this framework. And through our work, we've been supporting investors to help encourage the remaining 50% of global oil and gas production to sign up to this framework and start reporting through it. And at its core, OGMP is a framework that helps provide industry with the tools necessary to go out and address methane emissions at large from the oil and gas industry in a way that's credible and that will meaningfully drive deep reductions in the oil and gas industry. So I think we see this as one example of a win-win for investors, where you can raise what is a relatively simple and straightforward ask, where leading members of industry are already taking part with companies to join this framework, while also making key progress and significantly moving the needle on a key climate issue. And I think finally, using this step one, this kind of table stakes in net zero as an opportunity to work collaboratively with companies to build trust and work towards more challenging decarbonization topics, whether it's policy or scope 3 targets. So maybe it'll on there, but just say thanks again for the opportunity to present.
Thanks so much, Dominic. I think that's really relevant and interesting in terms of where things are headed now. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'll try and ask around 3 questions maybe of our panelists and jump back to some of the issues covered. And I might jump back to you, Ilse. You whipped us through an incredible presentation into the work there. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about where this is heading and what's next in terms of the satellite methane collection.
Yeah, so depending a little bit how far ahead you want to look. I mean, from my perspective, on our agenda, somewhere at the top is looking at these surface mines and see to what extent what we're seeing. I have seen on this one mine in Australia and the Kazakhstan one, how many more of those do we have? What does it mean? We need to dig into which mines show these huge emissions, because this has quite an impact, I think, on what is being reported right now and our knowledge. When we move ahead, I mean, really make big steps like what I was showing, the new satellites coming up, that we will have much more capability. We'll go from, let's say, reporting these one by one cases to something more systematic, mapping out these emissions and being able to do something about that, hopefully. But that's in a nutshell. Not sure.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you. One to watch. Absolutely. I'll be looking out for your papers. We've got a question that's come through from Dan, and it relates to a question that I was thinking as well. And maybe I'll throw to you, Anatoly, and then maybe someone from EDF as well. In terms of, we're hearing from some of the coal mining companies in particular that it's not plausible, the emissions that are coming out, or there's nothing that can be done about it in terms of coal mine methane. How can we build on what's been happening in oil and gas, and is that transferable to coal mine methane?
Well, I think OGMP 2.0 is actually a fairly straightforward concept, which is that companies commit every year to improve their measurement techniques, and also to improve the mitigation by a certain amount. So they're not asked to become perfect in year one, but actually just follow some sort of steps towards getting better. Coal mine methane is actually somewhat easier than oil and gas methane measurements, because it's a handful of individual shafts, or it's like a mining area that's far more controllable than thousands of kilometers of pipelines. And so I think it's totally feasible, as has been shown today with the new technologies coming out. And on mitigation, they're saying they cannot mitigate, but they are not measuring. So like, how could you say you can't mitigate something you don't even understand how much you have of? Like the Hale Creek volumes, it sounds like a substantial amount that could probably be used to generate electricity if we understand where it's coming from. Because at the moment, no one even understands what's happening. But chances are it's actually something that is capturable and destroyable, as an example. But we don't know, because no one's really measuring or looking for this.
Thank you. And from a data perspective, did anyone want to add more in terms of what's needed? Do we need all of the data from all of the various methodologies that we've heard about today to be in line?
I mean, I can take a stab at this thing, and going back to what you originally said, Naomi, I think the coal industry sort of the first reaction being denial of like our emissions can't possibly be this high, I think is something that we saw in the oil and gas industry before, because you're questioning their source of truth, like what they believe their methane emissions to be from their their methods of estimating. But over time, the oil and gas industry, through the studies that the scientists on this call and beyond have done on the oil and gas industry, the evidence becomes overwhelming, and then you have acceptance, and then you have large swaths of the industry joining frameworks like the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership. So I think this is a natural starting point for engagement with the coal industry, where it's like, this cannot be possibly true. Our emissions cannot be 2 or 3 times what we think they are. And I think Dr. Hacker kind of, it was like, it touched upon it, but it's like multi-layered technology that's going to get around this. It's going to be the constellation of satellites that Dr. Abin talked about, of different sort of spatial resolutions and sensitivities, and that will be verified by, or at least the methods can be verified by overflights or flying transects upwind or downwind of these. So it's not a one-size-fits-all silver bullet to being able to quantify methane from coal emissions, but what we've learned in the oil and gas industry is these different technology types click together quite nicely to build up a much better picture. And to Dan's question specifically, I think Anatoly mentioned the Met Coal Methane Partnership, which is UNEP, EDF, and others are thinking about how does a measurement-based frameworks that are developing in the oil and gas industry, how might they be adapted to fit the coal industry? So that's at an early stage, but something that will emerge.
I have a question around funding, and it's something that Dimitri, you touched on, and also Jorg, in your sort of presentations and overviews. Obviously, all of this technology isn't going to be cheap. Dimitri, do you want to share any insights from your work over many years in this space and some of the barriers and opportunities?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, particularly at the start of accepting that this is an issue. Funding is always an issue. In Australia, there is governments are not that forthcoming with money for this, and the risk is then that the studies that are going to be carried out are not sufficiently funded to do exactly what they are supposed to be doing and give real answers to what emissions are. So that is a real risk. I think industry in general can play a real participative role and work with governments and the NGOs to accept that this is an issue. Yeah, we talked about denial, but at some point they'll come around. And the most helpful attitude is to contribute to the investments that are required. It's certainly not cheap, but I believe that we are too far down the effects of climate change that companies can just let it to civil society or governments to solve this. So I think, certain oil and gas companies are in the position to work with others to make this a real opportunity to solve these emissions.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, but very keen to allow panelists to jump back in with any sort of final thought on that or anything else before we close.
Well, maybe to add, I think the cost that it gives society now, but that we're sort of not paying for yet in hard dollars or euros or whatever currency you want to speak, is far greater than whatever we need to address this now. So I think that we should keep in mind. And the sooner we invest, the better.
I think that's a pretty pertinent way to close us off, Ilse. So I'm going to leave it there. I'd like to give a big thanks to all the panelists for coming and sharing your expertise time today. And also thank you to all the participants. Please be in touch. This is the beginning of a conversation for many of us, and there's much to do we can put people in touch with all of the fantastic experts here today and many more who are working in this space and keen to collaborate. So I'll call it there, and thank you very much to everyone.